In this unit, we're going to take a closer look and focus on Egypt as one of the early civilizations we want to focus on for our understanding of the grander scheme. In the earlier ones, we took a look at some of the ideas of Mesopotamia, especially looking at the idea of the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, taking a look at religious ideas and belief, and then, of course, the very simple writing system of cuneiform that will be, of course, changing over time. Now we're going to go and take a closer look at the Egyptian example and notice here that there's going to be some significant parallels, but also some significant differences, and we'll take a look at that. The first thing to take a look at here is that within the context of Egyptian society, there is a time frame where what they do is they list time in Egypt by dynasty, by the ruling family. And you'll see that there are many, many dozens of those, and it's just a device that your book is going to use to keep track of time and show you sort of a progress towards the modern day. All right? That's the way they do Egyptian society. They list it by dynasty and then by the successes of that dynasty. All right? And then, of course, in parallel with that, they will give you specific dates. What I want to do here for a second, with that being a sort of a grounding, I want to go back and take a look at the concept that was first mentioned earlier with the idea of, remember, Hammurabi accepting the law code from the god Shamash in his Mesopotamian society in Babylon. Let's now go to Egypt for a second for a parallel idea. Inside of Egyptian society, as we look at it, the River Nile was a key element. It was the foundation stone of the Egyptian society. And it is also a very interesting geographic thing. The River Nile, of course, starts in Central Africa and flows basically north through a series of countries to Egypt and then enters into the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll see that in a second on the map. What's different about the Nile, though, is like the Tigris and Euphrates, it will be the backbone of society. Access to fresh water. It will also supply the water for irrigation systems for sedentary agriculture. What will be interesting for us to think about is that while the Tigris and the Euphrates are totally unpredictable, and that their flood and their dry seasons can be very variable and really alter people's perceptions of time and success in farming, the Nile almost works like clockwork in the sense that the rising of it and the flood of the Nile can almost be predicted. In Egyptian society, what started to happen was the concept that the pharaoh, in our sense, you can think of him as the leader, the king, but let's use the word pharaoh because that's a specific term that they use. The pharaoh was more than a political leader, more than a religious leader, and more than just a man. So let's take a look at this for a second. The pharaoh is a link to the divine, the idea that there is a human representation on earth of the divine will of the gods and goddesses. Now, in Mesopotamia, it had sort of been indicated that it was the king Hammurabi and his successors. In the Egyptian context, it's the pharaoh. The pharaoh is seen as that divine link between the wants, needs, and desires of humanity and the wants, needs, and desires of the gods and goddesses. So as part of that concept, the pharaoh was not just a man, but a very divine man in the sense that he had a body and a soul. Now, in the concept that emerges inside of Egyptian belief, it's the concept of Ka, K-A, all right? That's not a typo. It is this idea that that is essentially a soul, a connection between the human form of the pharaoh that has a body and ages and eats and is a regular human, but at the end of their life, it is not the end, it is the beginning for them, in the sense that they have an immortal Ka, an immortal soul. Now, one thing to think about here, and this will help us understand this concept. In Egyptian religious belief, there had been multiple gods and goddesses, and one of the key ones was a god named Osiris. Now, in the story, Osiris is eventually killed by his brother, and the body is chopped into multiple pieces and thrown into the River Nile. All right? The loyal spouse of Osiris gathers the body pieces back together, reforms the body, and it comes back to life. Osiris lives again. Now, this is the concept, if you want to think of it, as resurrection. The body has died, but now it is going to be living on again. All right? That same concept will pop up in other religious beliefs. We saw it in Mesopotamia, and now it is in Egypt. All right? Now, in this story of Osiris coming back, now Osiris has died, has been sort of resurrected and re-put together, right? Almost like a Humpty Dumpty kind of story. They put the pieces back together again. Now Osiris is back together and is now going to be the god in charge of the underworld. He's going to be the god that you will see as you enter into Judgment Day, right? Now, in the concept that I'm thinking here and that you're going to see, Judgment Day is also a concept that will pop up in other religious beliefs. It'll be the end time. It will be the apocalypse. It will be the end of time period, the day when all the souls of the earth will be judged by their gods or goddesses. Now, in the concept of Egyptian religious belief, and it's very complex, but let me get at it this way. You'll see more complexity in the books you're reading, but what I want to focus on for a second is the classic idea in Egyptian belief that you have to prepare for your sort of interview. So what happens in Egyptian society is the priests who are conducting the different ceremonies eventually create a book. And the book is telling people how they should approach the Judgment Day, how they should approach the idea that they're going to be judged. And in the concept that's laid out for them, your heart, your human heart, is going to go on a scale, and it will be weighed against a feather in terms of, were you pure? Did you live a virtuous life? Did you provide charity? Were you humane? Think about all the deeds, good or bad, in your life, and your whole heart is going to be the substance, and that heart is going to be weighed against a feather. Now, notice that that's a very high standard of purity for entering into an excellent afterlife. We'll just let that go for a second. But in the way the Egyptians predict this and show this Judgment Day, the concept is simple. You have to prove how pure you were. And if you fail the test, if your heart is found to be unequal to the feather, there is then immediately a monster there to devour you. If, on the other hand, your heart, which has been pure and true, does pass through, now you get to go on to the good afterlife with Osiris. So what I want you to think about there is this concept early on in Egyptian belief of resurrection. There's also this idea of judgment, and that there is a reward or a punishment for the way in which you lived your life. Now, these are relatively simple religious concepts that you can see in lots of other faiths, but we're starting to get to a point where many of these have some very interesting parallels and are very intriguing, especially if we're going to follow up on the ideas of cultural borrowing. Okay? Now, another thing to notice within religious belief in Egypt is it is polytheistic, and it does have a multiple numbers of gods and goddesses, each one of which needs to be appeased, all right? Through ritual, through prayer, through construction, sometimes through sacrifice at their temple or at their special location that's associated with that god or that goddess. And up and down the River Nile, during the various dynasties, and you'll see this, various different religious groups created temples in different places, and you'll see them up and down the River Nile. And in each case, what you see is that they have a simple concept that there is a religious idea and a belief system linked to a physical place and to concepts that go with it, right? But if you take a look at the way in which the Egyptians use their territory, right? The Nile River has been the backbone, like Tigris and Euphrates River valleys in Mesopotamia. The Nile is the backbone of society in Egypt. Most people live within a couple of miles of its banks that are usually used very carefully for agricultural production because they can use the fresh water from the Nile that has a predictable flood stage. Irrigation can also be used to make sure that the food production stays high. So the population can grow significantly in the Nile River Valley, much like it had done in Mesopotamia as well. What's also interesting about the Nile is that if you go a few kilometers either side of the Nile into areas out here on the peripheries, you are going to see in that dark green area on the map, that's essentially the Nile River Valley that is highly populated and also extensively used for agricultural and trade, or agricultural production and trade. Outside of that, if you go just a few more kilometers on either side of the Nile River, you are in very intense desert. Because remember, Egypt is not having massive food production in the Nile River Valley because of natural rainfall. They are getting their food production by using significant resources from the fresh water of the Nile to irrigate and to grow food that way. So they're not relying on rain, they're relying on the irrigation system of the Nile. If you go either side of the Nile River into the areas that are lighter green, you'll notice that if you had a picture of those places, they would be classic Sahara desert. Sand, virtually no plant or animal life living in those areas, and that in many ways that helped isolate Egypt. Egyptian society, the dynasties that are talked about in your text, develop along the Nile, but the only way to get to them is from either coming through the ocean at the mouth of the Nile River at the Mediterranean Sea, or to come down the Nile from interior in Africa and follow the water into Egypt. On either side of the Nile, the Egyptian Nile is protected. Egyptian society and culture can develop in relative safety, stability, and isolation away from significant military threats on either side of them. That does not stop having military or other threats from above or below them in terms of accessing, but they have a much more stable society. And its comparison with the Mesopotamian societies we talked about, that Fertile Crescent area, as you saw in your reading, you went through a significant number of societies and cultures, lots of different names of people speaking different languages. In Egyptian history, it's much more stable, it's much more predictable, and in part, that helps us understand why the Nile is so vital to Egyptian development and why it turns out to be the key understanding of why Egyptian society is stable and why it is able to function at a relatively high level in a relatively wealthy level for a very, very long time. Make sure that you go back into your reading and extract some of the key interesting issues here about how Egyptian development takes place, and please make sure to take a look at those sample questions.